A controversial new law in Arizona spells out what happens to frozen embryos when a couple gets divorced. The state law took effect on July 1st. It requires courts to give embryos to the spouse who plans to use them to have a baby. Supporters of the law say it will protect a partner's right to his or her embryos. Opponents say it could force people to become parents against their will. Tony Dokoupil has a story of one ex-couple at the center of this fight. Tony, really interesting story here.
Incredible debate. Really fascinating. Good morning, everybody. More and more couples are deciding to freeze their embryos in hopes of one day becoming parents. The Department of Health and Human Services says there are more than 600,000 frozen embryos in the U.S. But what happens when these couples divorce? The legal dispute over who can use those embryos has become increasingly complex.
I wanted to one day become a mom.
Ruby Torres always wanted kids, so when she was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2014, she decided to undergo in vitro fertilization.
I wasn't sure what was going to happen in my future, and so I wanted to ensure that I had that option.
Doctors used her eggs and her then-fiance's sperm to form 7 embryos, but by the time she was medically cleared to try to get pregnant, they were divorcing, and he no longer wanted children. A judge ruled that Torres had no right to use the embryos.
I was disappointed. I was angry. There's a potential for children to be born that will have my DNA, and I will never hold them. I will never see them.
In similar cases across the country, courts often rule in favor of the person who does not want the embryos used. But a new Arizona state law would change that. The legislation gives custody of the embryos to the spouse who intends to allow them to develop to birth. CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman.
Most courts that have looked at the situation of embryos have decided that they will only bring the embryos to term if both sides mutually consent. Apparently in Arizona, under this legislation, you can compel someone to have a child they do not want to have.
Claudia Work represents Torres' ex-husband, John Terrell. She says the law could have devastating consequences for people like her client.
You're hoping to move on, and you've got an ex who is essentially asking for you to impregnate them and have this lingering, lifelong tie with them.
The new law says the spouse that is not awarded the embryos has no parental responsibilities and no right, obligation, or interest with respect to the child, meaning they wouldn't be forced to pay child support. Still, Work says there are other costs in becoming a parent.
And even if the law states that they're not a legal parent, they're still an emotional parent. It's virtually impossible to separate themselves from the fact that their ex had a child that is biologically theirs.
Some abortion rights advocates also have concerns the law is aimed at establishing the personhood of unborn embryos, which they say could have consequences for women's reproductive rights. And with conflicting rulings around the country, legal experts say this issue could go all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, if you're wondering, the law cannot be applied retroactively, and therefore it shouldn't directly affect the Torres case, which we featured. That is under appeal, so the judge will decide.
Well, that's
a very tough situation.
That seems to get, if you go into the in vitro knowing that this could be a possible consequence, that seems a lot different than if it changes while you're in the middle of it.
You know, the law says that the father, the would-be father, wouldn't have to pay child support, has no obligation, but no law, no judge can change the fact that a child will come knocking at some point.
Yeah.
There are obligations to becoming a parent.
But it could be her only chance, too. I'm saying, you know, I might not want your crusty butt, but I do want my baby.
It's true.
Yeah. And so why couldn't they read something that the parent signs that you will have no financial responsibility or obligation to this child, that you give it up?
What about the emotional responsibility?
Right. You know, it's tough.
You see both sides really in this story.
Right. Tony, that was great.
There are two sides, I guess. I feel for the woman.
I do too. I feel for both parties.
Okay.
All right.